Chris Curtis is one of the nicest guys you'll find at the UFC, but some things just push him off the edge. In recent memory, Chris revealed that a Street Fighter crossed paths with the Action Man. What happened next? Well, we're about to tell you the whole story. In this video, we'll be talking about how a 200-0 Street Fighter loses to Chris Curtis and says he could have won. First off, how did the Street Fighter meet Curtis? Turns out he just walked into the UFC gym. Chris has been boasting about his 3-0 ever since he made his UFC debut last year, and he was lined up to replace Darren Till against middleweight contender Jack Hermanson. This was going to be the biggest fight for Curtis to date, and it's also the fight that could launch him into another top 10 matchup. So, before such a big match, what do? That's right, you practice. Ahead of UFC London, Curtis and his team members, including Sean Strickland, were having a typical day at the gym. That was until an unknown man walks in, claims to be an unbeaten Street Fighter, and challenges everyone to a fight. Now, that doesn't happen on a typical day, does it? According to Strickland, the man took a hit at the coach and kept trying to convince everyone that he stands at 200-0 in the streets. Then, Curtis took matters into his own hands. As we said, Curtis is a nice man, but someone walking into his gym and disrespecting his crew, that's not the kind of thing Curtis would tolerate. Strickland said that the Street Fighter wouldn't stop running his mouth until Curtis stepped in. The Action Man decided to shut this guy up once and for all, so he challenged him to a sparring session. He told the guy that instead of running his mouth, he should be up in the cage with him. Curtis was the first in the whole gym to take this guy up for a fight. Of course, the UFC fighter wouldn't be afraid of any common street fighter. Of course, the loudmouth learned a lesson. The delusional fighter accepted Curtis's challenge and was ready to step into the cage with him. But the moment he did, all his delusions were blown away with just one punch from the Action Man. That's right, people call Curtis the Action Man for good reason, and nobody knows it better than the Street Fighter now. As everyone expected, Curtis beat the Street Fighter down to a pulp during the entire fight. The so-called unbeaten champion looked like a quitter when he got a few blows from the UFC fighter. Fighting in the street is one thing, but fighting against a UFC champion, that's a whole other story. The loudmouth clearly had nothing against the UFC middleweight. In fact, Curtis could have knocked him out or caused serious damage, but he let him get away easy. The Action Man just wanted to teach this Street Fighter a lesson, and we're pretty sure that he did. But get this, he wasn't done talking yet. When everyone thought the drama was over and they could go back to training for UFC London, the Street Fighter had more things to say. In a wild turn of events, the unknown man went ahead and claimed that he could have KO'd Curtis right after he got thumped by him. If we made a list of things you shouldn't say to a UFC champion, this would be on top. Of course, Curtis didn't appreciate the loudmouth running his mouth again, so he started yelling too. By this point, the UFC fighter was all fired up with rage. He even challenged the guy to put some gloves on and get inside the cage for another lesson. The video footage clearly shows that the man's comments left Curtis in quite the tizzy. He asked the guy to put his glove on or leave. But that wasn't all. The Action Man even said that he was just toying with him and that he could have ripped the Street Fighter in half if he wanted to. Curtis also explained why he was the first to challenge the Street Fighter, and that's because everyone else in there would have messed the poor guy's life up. He didn't hold back on his words when he said that if the Street Fighter can prove his fighting skills inside the cage, Curtis would change his life forever. But in the end, talking was all this so-called Street Fighter could do. After hearing Curtis's dark side talk, the man didn't dare to step back inside the cage. That's a lucky decision for the man's sake, because everyone knows what would have happened if he took another step closer to Curtis. From what we saw in the video, the guy claiming to be 200-0 couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag, let alone fight the man who's co-headlining UFC London soon. And now, on to some other UFC news. What really happened between Hermanson and Curtis? UFC London was supposed to be a meeting of two gentlemen middleweights, but it ended up showing us the uglier sides of both fighters. After Hermanson took the win over Curtis after the co-main event, he shouted a comment that just put more flame to the fire. He responded to Curtis's double bird with a questionable statement. Even though we all heard Hermanson on the broadcast, he took to the press to confirm exactly what happened during that encounter. In his statement, Hermanson said that he and Curtis were good and friendly coming into the fight. He added that he thinks Curtis got frustrated with what happened during the fight, so he lifted a finger up after the decision was announced. Even though Hermanson admitted that things got heated at the moment, he confirmed that the two fighters met up later that night and squashed the beef. We're assuming that means they're back to being became friends now. In fact, Hermansson tried to apologize seconds after the insult left his mouth, but Curtis just wasn't having it back then. After the fight, the Action Man further expressed his frustration at Hermansson, but also blamed himself for an underwhelming performance. Before we could call it a night, the two reconciled and Hermansson shared the moment on Instagram. Next up, we finally heard the insider story of how Curtis Blaydes and Tom Aspinall came to share a beer. A few days ago, Blaydes had a face-off against Aspinall in the UFC London main event. Unfortunately, the bout was over before it even began, with Aspinall injuring his knee. Later that night, the British heavyweight took to social media to post a photo of the two sharing a beer. That's what left us all confused. Are these two friends? In an interview with the MMA Hour, Blaydes said that the meetup was quite random. In fact, it was promoted by the men's fathers. Blaydes said that his dad was in the lobby downstairs at one of the bars when he bumped into Aspinall's dad. He went ahead to explain that his dad's a talker and he'd make friends with anybody. The next thing Blaydes knew was his dad walking into his room and asking him to come up to Aspinall's room to have a drink. They headed up there, and according to Blaydes, Aspinall's whole crew was super cool, friendly, and inviting. Now that's a UFC friendship that we never saw coming, thanks to the dads, of course. Also, Dana White had some colorful things to say to those trolling him on the internet. 2 weeks ago, UFC President Dana White surprised Kyle Forgeard with a birthday present that we'd only dream of. The gift was $250,000 in cash. And of course, many current and former UFC fighters had a lot of thoughts on the matter. When White finally had enough of the trolling, he took his moment on Twitter to send quite the aggressive message to all the people on the internet. No, really, he said something great that rhymes with "go duck yourself." You get it. The UFC president also said that he'll spend his money however he wants to. He added that if you look at what Kyle and the Nelk boys have done, they've never asked him for anything. In fact, White went ahead to explain that the $250,000 he gave him for his birthday doesn't cover the number of things that kid has done for him. Looks like White has zero tolerance for trolling, so we wouldn't suggest making any more memes about him. And before we go, we need to tell you which new UFC player has a big future ahead of him. According to the UFC president, there are big things ahead for Paddy Pimblett. He's been perfect inside the octagon during his limited time and even has 3 consecutive finishes already. Pimblett just started out at the UFC Apex facility in Las Vegas in September 2021, but since then, he's been receiving quite the praise. In his debut match, the budding fighter got a raucous ovation after his super impressive first-round knockout. In a statement to the press, White said that this new kid has that Conor McGregor vibe. Even though it's too soon to talk about championship stuff right now, White knows that his aura when he's in the arena, and the way fans receive him shows that he's off to a fantastic start. And that's a wrap for this video. What did you think about Curtis's surprise fight with the Street Fighter? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more awesome content like this. See you next time.